Hello, Ruth. How are you today?
Hi there. I'm good.
So good to have you here on the podcast. Really excited for this episode of Stories We Haven't Shared. Ruth is someone I was introduced to a couple months ago and immediately understood why we were meant to know each other. Ruth is a TEDx and inspirational speaker, a former nonprofit leader and CEO, disability specialist, inclusion expert. In her work, which she will tell you more about, she empowers leaders to foster an inclusive and diverse culture of unhiding in order to unleash untapped potential and ignite innovation. She's a best-selling author who's published 2 books, including this year's publication of Unhide and Seek, Live Your Best Life, Do Your Best Work. When she and I first spoke, I think I probably looked like a bobblehead doll because everything that she was saying to me resonated so deeply. So I just was doing a lot of head nodding. And while the details of her stories are different, there are deep common threads underlying the things that we've worked through and then the places that we've landed with what we've learned. So just so happy to have you here today. Thank you again for being here.
No, me too. And I'm so glad I'm not the only one that feels like a bobblehead sometimes.
Yes.
Especially when it resonates with people that you resonate with. It just feels like that's what you're doing constantly.
God, do I actually look like that or do I just think I look like that? But yeah.
And then you watch the replay and you do look like
there it is. Awesome. So tell us what you would like us to know about what you do professionally.
Sure. I had a big career pivot at one point, Shanti. As you mentioned in my intro, I was a nonprofit leader, a nonprofit CEO. I worked with underrepresented, under-resourced communities, specifically young people, and thinking about access to education, access to mentoring, access to career, and pivoted about 3 years ago now to becoming a TEDx speaker, inspirational speaker, and best-selling author. And not really looked back. And I was somebody who always admired women specifically who had 2 or 3 careers. I just never knew that could be me. Yeah, I'm excited to dive in with you and dig into this.
And I know we'll learn more about what inspired that pivot as we keep going. And then personally, anything that you want to share, what lights you up, things that people may not know, whatever comes to your heart to share.
I think a big piece is when I think about myself, I was somebody who was never moving to New York. And now I've been here 30 years. I was somebody who hid so much for so long, so much a part of myself. And yet now seeing the world and traveling and expanding my horizons and expanding myself is such a big piece. And this idea of connection, that really lights me up. Somebody asked me recently what my dream job be. And I said, well, I have it. And he said, no, really, what's your dream job? I'm like, well, no, again, I have it. But if you're pressing me to have a job, like you're really pressing me to think about it, I would love to be a UN ambassador to some country or a UNICEF ambassador, right? To like thinking about how do we bridge the world together and how do we bring people together? I find people fascinating. I find their stories fascinating. And I think it's because for so long, I didn't feel so connected to them. I felt so shuttered in.
Now you're craving an extra dose.
Craving connection, craving community all the time.
It's great. And it's funny about New York. I also said I would never live in New York. And note to self, just about everything I've said that I would never do, I've done. So I have to be very careful about that. But I spent over a decade there and really enjoyed it despite whatever I perceived I would do. Yeah. So tell us what your pronouns are.
Sure. She, her, hers.
Okay. And this is a podcast that's about the extra layers underrepresented people go through as we wind our way into the already complicated career landscape. So essentially it's the outsiders and working our way into our careers. How do you define yourself as an outsider in your story?
So much of my life, I have felt like an outsider who craved fitting in and did anything I could to fit in. As someone with a disability, I have felt like I had to fit into every image of what others thought was beautiful, what others thought was successful, what looked quote unquote normal. I think there's a couple layers there. I think there's the disability layer of what does it mean to feel othered when you have a disability. Mine happens to be a physical disability. So though people are like, but you can't really hide it, I managed to for 25 years, which takes a toll on how you see yourself when you feel like you have to hide. I think there's the gender piece to this conversation, which is feeling like other in conversations, especially around some of the corporate work that I've done. And I think the other piece that doesn't often get talked about is ethnicity piece in terms of race. And for many years, as a nonprofit leader running organizations that were typically working with under-resourced neighborhoods. I was a white female with she series pronouns, heterosexual, and people thinking, well, she won't understand us. She doesn't know what it's like to be other. And I wasn't sharing the disability journey and feeling othered. So of course, there was that kind of layer of people feeling like she won't understand. And so that's a piece of the otherness and how it intersects with kind of the stories that I haven't shared.
That's interesting. The fact that you were called to work with undersourced communities, and therefore as the straight white woman in the room who wasn't sharing the disability, that made you an outsider. So it's the reversal of what we typically think about, but it set you apart in ways that interfered with connection.
Absolutely. At points, my disability connected me to the young people that would find out and would know about it. But I think the teams that I worked with, sometimes it didn't, because I wasn't sharing that part of it. I wasn't sharing the challenges. I wasn't sharing, because the beauty of kids, right, Shanti, is they'll ask about something and then they move on. I think as adults, we then layer it with a lot of experience. We layer it with a lot of beliefs. We layer it with things that we're told and some of our assumptions about people, and we don't always get it right.
Yeah. Do you feel like the people, when you were in groups, that they sensed that there was something that you were holding back?
Yes. At one point, when I was leading an organization, we were in a conversation about the word diversity and leadership and what did it really look like? What did it mean? How do we lead and think about diversity? And I asked a really naive question. I said, do you see me as diverse? And the answer back was, not really. For all the things that you just listed, Shanti, right? The white, the female, the she series pronouns, the heterosexual, that wasn't considered diversity. And they said, maybe gender. You're a woman, so you can check that box. That's diverse. And I asked a follow-up question, which was, what about my disability? And for your audience, the listeners that are listening, I was born with a limb difference. I'm missing my left hand, or a fully formed left hand. When I asked that question about my limb difference and my disability, the response was, oh, we don't even see you like that. And I'm like, I'm not asking to be seen like anything. I'm asking for it to be acknowledged as part of diversity, because to me, diversity is about different experiences. It's about different perspectives. That's true diversity. And I started reaching out to corporate partners. I started reaching out to people who had been doing this DEI work, and disability wasn't showing up a lot, both visible disabilities and non-apparent. And it wasn't showing up in the diversity conversation. And while I walked away really upset from that initial conversation where I asked, what about my disability? I realized, Shanti, at that point, in answering your question, is I hadn't really shared my disability journey with anyone. I really hadn't talked about some of the challenges or the successes of having a disability.
So you hadn't discussed it, so no one else really was comfortable to do it either, or knew how to.
For sure. There weren't a lot of openings in the conversation to be able to talk about it with me.
Fascinating. I think we'll pivot. I know you have a story that you want to share, and I'd love to just turn it over to you and let you tell the listeners.
Yeah. And thank you for giving space, because oftentimes, and maybe your listeners too, oftentimes we don't realize the stories that we do carry in terms of some of the things that have challenged our experiences, some of the things that have made us who we are. I know for me, I started hiding my hand at the age of 13. And Shanti, for many of us, going to a new high school, just being in high school has a lot of its own emotion attached to it, right? Like high school is a time of fitting in. High school is a time of feeling awkward. High school is a time of finding parts of yourself that you might not have understood before. For me, it was a time of seeing myself and heading to this new high school. And I remember, and I'm closing my eyes because I remember it so clearly, getting on that yellow school bus and heading to the new high school. My biggest worry was, what was I wearing? Would I make friends? What teachers would I like? Would I do well? And I got onto that bus, and I remember other kids getting on as we picked up more and more kids. And someone at one point looked at me and then looked at my hand and stared at it too long. Like just, it was uncomfortable. And my immediate reaction to that was, just put it in your pocket. Just tuck it away. It was the fall, so it was still warm out. I didn't have long sleeves. So my initial impulse was just tuck it into your pocket. And I never thought that small action would lead to a lifelong pattern of hiding my hand like that. As I think about the people who are listening to us, I think many of us do that, right? We choose a small action, never realizing the consequences that it might impact how we see ourselves and how others see us. And that small action lasted for 25 years, 25 really long years.
Yeah. So I watched your TEDx, which is phenomenal, by the way. And you said something in the TEDx about there's a momentum in telling the truth. So once you start to unhide, there's a momentum to that. And I'm wondering, do you think there's also a momentum in not telling the truth?
Yes, there is momentum in hiding. It's a really good insight. There is momentum in hiding because there's a couple things. There's two things that I think about when I think about the momentum of hiding. Is once you do it once, it's like lying, right? It just gets easier to keep up the lie, even though it feels harder because now you got to figure out where it is. It feels safer to keep something hidden because you've built up so much of a story in your head of what it could mean to actually share that story or share that lie or share that hiding, that it's not worth it. So the momentum is something that you've created, and sometimes externally is created by what we see in media and what we see, what we read, and what we hear from even our friends. So we keep that momentum going. And I think the other piece with hiding is you don't know how to unhide sometimes. You don't know how to get out of the lie. You don't know how to get out of the hiding. I tried so many times when I would start a new school or I'd start a new year thinking, this time I'm not going to hide. I'm going to start this new job. I'm not going to hide. And I didn't have the tools or the kind of insight and introspection at that point to know how to do it. I didn't have the support around me and I didn't support myself because I didn't know how. And so that's what the other thing about the momentum of hiding is we don't always know how to get out of it.
Yeah. And I would imagine the listeners might think 25 years, how's that even possible? I hid very actively for, depending on what level of hiding you want to talk about. It was a couple of years in one version of coming out, and then 10 years, and then 20 years. It was a lot of years of unpacking, unhiding. And you said it gets easier in a way because you get used to doing it, but then it gets more and more tangled. It almost feels like a web, right? It just surrounds you. And then
100%.
How do you get out of that? Like it's gotten so big and twisted.
And you often feel so alone in it because you think you're the only one that has ever felt that need to hide or that tangle of webs around you. You believe that you are the only one that's hiding. Right. And so that becomes hard to untangle those webs because you're not sure where to get support. And truth is, Shanti, it's not an overnight process. It's not a flip of a switch that all of a sudden you're going to say, I'm going to start coming out or sharing my secret or unhiding. It doesn't happen like that. I think sometimes we get fooled by TV movies or movies in general, or even articles we read that we think, oh, somebody just all of a sudden was able to come out or share part of themselves. That's not reality.
Yeah, that's come up on previous episodes, coming out, whether it's coming out about your sexual orientation or a limb difference or whatever it might be. It's an ongoing process. It really never ends because you're always meeting new people. You're always in new situations. And ideally, it gets easier. It becomes second nature in some ways, but you're still constantly doing it.
And still constantly also wrestling with the pain that came with the reason that you started hiding in the first place.
Right.
And I actually am writing a post about this today on LinkedIn because, and this is a story I haven't shared out yet, so you're the first to hear it. I was able last week to go to a documentary film about someone who was a baseball player for the Yankees. He happened to also have a limb difference like mine. His name is Jim Abbott. He was known in 1993 as he had a no-hitter game, so got a lot of kudos and recognition for that. And they made a documentary about him. And so I went to support the limb difference community to be there. When I went into the theater, I took my seat and turned around, and there was somebody that had actually helped me unhide, who was Shaquem Griffin, who was drafted for the Seattle Seahawks in 2018. Now, I've written a book, 2 books. I did a TEDx talk. I thought I've worked through a lot of this. And I can tell you the next 2 days after seeing that film and meeting Shaquem, somebody again, who was my role model in part of Unhiding, triggered a lot of emotion. It was still there. And one of my limb different friends, a friend who has a limb difference, said to me, Ruth, you got to experience what so many of us experienced with your book single-handedly. That we saw ourselves in it. You haven't given yourself the permission or had the opportunity to see yourself in someone else. That's why you're emotional, because you got to finally feel it in a different way.
Yeah. Just sit with your own place in it. Yeah.
And allow for those emotions to come up, because it is, as we were just saying, unhiding, it's a journey. There's a reason that we felt the need to hide, for whether it was 1 year, whether it was 10 years or the 20 that you talked about. There's reasons that we've built up. And so that doesn't disappear either overnight.
Yeah.
And I think that's a piece that I've been on this learning journey, even just over the last week, to really understand.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So your hiding this is going on 25 years, and I know just enough to know that you started to come to a point where it was a critical moment in that journey. And I actually haven't heard the story, so would you be open to sharing it?
Sure. Yeah, there gets a place where all that hiding is exhausting and it's lonely, and it does take a toll. It takes a toll on your mental health. It takes a toll on your physical health. For me, it also took a toll on my feeling of connection and relationships, not just with the teams I worked with at work or friends, but also in dating relationships. A lot of the walls that when we're hiding, we put up thinking, oh, they'll never love me if they find this out. And then when they do find out, you can't believe that they still like you or want to pursue and love you. And so you find another wall. You just build more walls. I kept building walls, and I got to a place that I was really lonely. And I realized, okay, something's wrong here. And I see this often now. You would think, I have a degree in psychology, a master's in social work. You would think I could see the pattern. And sometimes we're our own worst enemy in that way. I know we often say that. I couldn't see the connection between hiding and relationship. And why? Because I was telling people at some point, I was sharing it out, I was blurting it out and saying it to people, but I couldn't believe that I had built up so many difficult thoughts in my head about this difference and what it meant and how unlovable it was. And I went to therapy, and I had started dating someone, and the therapist suggested, he said, this guy seems like he's a good person for you. He's listening to you. Has empathy. He seems like he's curious. Maybe this is somebody you tried out with. I took his advice and tried it out. I do say this in the TEDx, so I'll repeat myself though, because I think we get so many messages, whether it's from magazines telling us that we have to love ourselves first, or spiritual guides and people saying, oh, you have to love yourself first before you can let anyone love you. And I disagree with that, Shanti. I think sometimes we don't know how to love ourselves, and we sometimes need help to do that. And I know for me, that was absolutely the case. I didn't know how to love my hand. I didn't know how to love myself. And so it meant choosing to invite someone in that I started to trust to be able to help me with that.
Yeah, I think that sometimes maybe we're too close to it. You talked about all of the knowledge and degrees that you had, but you couldn't see it for yourself. And I wonder if a part of why it becomes important to reach out to someone else is because we talked about that web before. You need someone to help pull you out. You're too far in. You can't see your way out of it without extending a hand to someone.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you extend this first outreach. It sounds like it went well. Is there anything additional that you could share with us about what started to then unlock for you? How quickly did that happen? How did it unfold from there?
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I think when you allow someone to come in, when you invite them in, and again, I think of this as a choice. It's really, for me, it's the second step in unhiding, because the first step is acknowledging it, right? Going to the therapist and understanding that there was something in my own heart that didn't feel right. Then that second step of inviting someone in. And for me, it started to just lower the walls. The walls started coming down a little bit. The toughness started coming down a little bit. The sweetness and the joy, and as corny as that may sound, started to come up. So people felt like I was more approachable. And I don't even know if it was authentic. I think it was just genuine. And I know they're the same word, but authenticity gets thrown out a lot as a word, a cliche word. I think there was just this genuine sweetness that came out that other people then felt like they could connect with me. And what's weird, Shanti, is not only were my external walls coming down so people could come in, but I could look out too. And I could
Mm-hmm.
start to see other people. I'll never forget, I was in a Duane Reade on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I saw someone with a limb difference just like mine. And I think in my old approach, I either wouldn't have wanted to see them or I would have ignored it, just not dealt with it. And instead, I went over and talked to her. We started talking about our limb differences, our hands. I didn't even call it a limb difference. I just called it my little hand. And I went over to her about her little hand, and we started talking. And at one point she said, there's a whole group of us out there. If you go on Facebook, there's something called the Lucky Finn Project.
Huh.
And I was like, Wounded Warrior Project? What? I'm not an amputee. And she said, no, Lucky Finn Project. It's for people with limb differences like us. And I rushed home. I'll never forget. I left, I think I was buying toilet paper and paper towels. And I was like, I don't even care about those things. I just want to go and see what this is. And sure enough, I went on. And at that point, this was now 6 years ago, there were 30,000 people with limb differences just like my hand.
Yeah.
So it's like finding your community, finding those people who you thought you were alone for so long. And I think it happens with every quote unquote marginalized group, right? When you find the people who have been through something like you, who have that shared experience, who have felt that aloneness, who have felt that feeling different, who have felt like, I just want to be myself. And you find them, it's like this glorious moment of, oh my God, I'm not alone. This group, Lucky Finn Project, actually has a picnic every July outside of Detroit. And I remember going to my first one and I was nervous. I'm not going to lie. I was really nervous. And I was nervous for two things. One is it meant confronting it and dealing with it, like going there and being like, okay, this is part of you. You've denied it for so long. And the second is, I know, but you're not denying it now. How are you going to be different? How are people going to see you? They're all going to be the same. And that's just not reality. They're not the same. Everyone comes to it with a different journey. And I found my space of how I'm different. But it's such a cool, unique thing because once those guardrails come down, it's like life shows up in such a beautiful, awesome way.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first time I went to a gay bar, it felt like coming home, and it's very difficult to describe, but I sat down and I just felt such a sense of centeredness and, to have that kind of a visceral reaction to sitting down in a room with four walls. And my wife is a little bit older than I am. And so she was a little worried how I would feel walking into this setting. And she saw it on me. She's like, oh, you just are so comfortable now. You're so happy to be here. I think the feeling that I had is similar, and you tell me, to what you were saying, which is just to know that there are a whole bunch of people that have been on a similar journey and that everyone in that room has a story. Of course, every human on the planet has a story, right? But that there was a story that everyone in that room had that has some parallels to yours that brought them to walk through the doors of that building that day. And there's just something when you've been feeling so outside of things for so long that for me felt just like exactly where it was meant to be.
Yeah, no, it's a homecoming. It's like a feeling of belonging. It's such a cool feeling. And it's emotional because for those of us who have felt like we needed to hide part of ourselves for so long, again, I go back to there's a reason we did it that was external and also internal, some of the unreliable narrating of our own stories. And then the emotional piece of why did we do that for so long? And then feeling comfortable with the stuff that comes up for us. It's a lot of relief. I often equate it, Shanti, to when you have to take a deep breath in, whether it's at a doctor's office or whether it's just you have to take a deep breath. And then the exhale that comes after the deep breath, that's what it feels like, is just being able to be yourself and be accepted and self-acceptance.
Yeah, definitely. As I was thinking about our interview today, the hiding for a period of time, there's some piece of it for me that feels, even if it's a task you need to do and you build it up in your mind and you keep avoiding it because you're like, oh, that's going to be a slog. I'm not looking forward to that. Then whatever amount of time passes, you finally get around to doing it. And you're like, what was I so worried about? That wasn't that bad. And this is more complicated, more nuanced. There are other things that go into it, but I think there is a piece of just building it up so much
Oh, think about how many people stay in toxic relationships, who stay in bad jobs, bad careers, bad bosses, bad employees. We stay in those things because, again, we've built it up that a change would mean what? Uncertainty. Part of the unhiding is the uncertainty of that life could be better and different, but we've built it up to be like, can't. And that's the career piece of this journey, right? Yeah, people stay in relationships. They hide behind tasks, to your point. They hide behind their kids. They hide behind stories they've told themselves about this thing. And yet the other side is actually often liberating.
Absolutely. So then you go through this and you are able to finally take that deep breath. And how does that start impacting your career journey?
It's like when you write something down and you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
I couldn't unsee it. I think at first it started out as I couldn't unsee that disability wasn't coming into the conversation on diversity. I couldn't unsee it. Everywhere I looked, whether it was a magazine article I read, whether it was a TV show I was watching when they were talking about diversity, disability wasn't showing up. And so that became the first piece to this crusade was, how do I expand the definition of diversity? How do I get involved in this conversation? And so did that TEDx talk and started writing that first book and realized it was the right time for a change in leadership for the organization and also for myself, in terms of what does next look like? What was my purpose in this world? Because I think so many of us search for purpose, right? And we get frustrated when we don't know why we were put here. We think, oh, this job feels so boring. This isn't my purpose. Or I'll just join a nonprofit and I'll get my purpose. Those are not the solutions. The solutions are looking in. It's the introspection time that we give ourselves. And for me, it was, okay, so how do I start to make a difference? And I remember the first few speeches I did, I was talking a lot about expanding diversity, but what was resonating for people, what they kept hearing was the hiding part. Because again, so many of us feel like we need to hide part of ourselves. And as I leaned into that, and not to be corny or cliche for you and your audience and the listeners, the universe met me. It was like it started showing up with really interesting possibilities around this idea of hiding. And how do we create spaces so that people can unhide in the workplace? Because I think we talk a lot about bringing your authentic self to work, being a good culture fit. And those two actually don't match, like totally. If we think about good culture fit in an old school way, we want you to fit into our culture, but yet we want you to bring your authentic self. I know, but that might not fit the culture. And I'm not totally convinced that we're ready yet for us to bring our full authentic selves because we don't have the coaches and the supports and the leaders in place who are creating that psychological safety, who are modeling that with themselves. Because so many of us, like myself, and Shanti, I am no different. I think about how I was as a leader. I definitely owned and was taught an old school leadership mentality of keep people at arm's length, don't show vulnerability. You have to have all of the answers. You have to be perfect. To some, I was unapproachable. To some, it worked really well. They liked it because they're like, I'm 9 to 5. I'm out. I don't need to know your story. I don't need to know whatever. I'm good. Just let me do my job. Well, for others, I miss them along the way. And so that's why I spend so much of my time now working with leaders to create those spaces so that their employees can unhide and thrive and belong. That's my journey. And that's the gift I got to figuring out, I think, the beginning of my purpose, which is why did I hide for so long? So that I could help others not hide so long.
Yeah.
That was exhausting.
Yeah. That's another big bobblehead moment for me. I spent the early part of my career in leadership doing what I call leadership by spreadsheet. It was an old school approach.
Yeah.
Didn't serve anyone. That became evident. I guess that was a blessing that it became evident so quickly. And everything I did from that point was an unfolding of being more vulnerable. Even as a leader, sometimes saying, hey, team, I don't have all the answers here. Can we figure this out together? Sharing more about myself as a human, et cetera, et cetera. And then all the good things followed from there. I think I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, or I don't remember where I found this, but prioritizing connection time really resonated with me too. I remember as a sales leader, it was old school, basically door knocking sales. So we would go out on the road and knock on doors. And I knew, and even said out loud at the time, that the majority of the good things that would happen would be from my time riding around in the car, going on the road with people. That was worth 20 one-on-ones or anything else that I could do. Just having that time to connect and be with people on a human level was golden and also a tremendous amount of fun.
And I think a couple things that you just said that I was like, I'm taking notes on this because I want to respond because I am the bobblehead right now. I think while your leadership was through spreadsheet, mine was through a clock. I thought that the more you could look at the clock and know how long things took or when people got in or when they left, that was leadership, like understanding time. And I think the other piece that I would add on to what you're saying in terms of that time with connection is a little bit what makes me sad about right now with remote work. I even remember traveling with some of my staff, getting to know them in such cool ways. I'll never forget when I found out one of my staff got married and she didn't want anyone really to know in the office, but what? So yeah, there's a lot that you learn when you take space with people.
Yeah. So I'm imagining in the work that you're doing now that you're encountering the ways that we hide in the traditional ways we might understand it, and maybe in some ways we don't traditionally think about it. Is that the case? What are some of the ways that you see people hiding that maybe people wouldn't normally think about?
Yeah. And the reason I use my hand as a tool to start the conversation is because I think that's the way we might think about it, right? Oh, I need to hide a disability because it's different. I need to hide something about my mental health or my neurodiversity. I should hide that. I should hide my sexual orientation because someone might not understand that. And then it keeps going. People have shared with me, they hide their relationship status, they hide their finances, they hide their trauma and their family background. When I speak, at one point, when I'm talking about the 4 steps to unhiding, I invite people to share on a postcard, anonymous postcard, what it is that they're hiding, because that's the first step, acknowledging it. And just a few weeks ago, a couple just stood out to me when I read them, because I have thousands of these postcards. And someone shared that they have cancer and they can't tell their manager. So health is a big thing. Someone else shared that they are 5.5 months pregnant and they can't share it with their supervisor. Somebody shared that they have a stutter. People hide their accents. Like, that's the kind of hiding. And there's kind of 3 things as you think about workplace scenarios in this, right? It's exhausting for the person that's hiding it. It's lonely. They're not actually really present in their work because they're thinking about, I hope no one finds out this thing.
Right.
No one finds out about my education. No one finds out about my relationship status. No one finds out about my messy divorce, like all that stuff. And you're thinking about it. So you're not really present. The second thing is the team that you're working on and your coworkers are making a lot of assumptions based on your behavior, right? Oh, she's not really open to things. He's not really open to it. They never come to the staff party. They never give ideas. They just seem like they're off-putting. So they're making a lot of assumptions about people's behavior without any real information. Like, that person who has cancer may be going to a lot of doctor's appointments and thinking about their health during a meeting and not getting the support from their team or from their manager. And it's a 2-way street. That is definitely true. They need to share and they need to be asked. And yet, how do we create support so that they can feel safe to share? And then the third place where I see it showing up in workplace and career is, if I'm a leader, I may not be looking at that person as someone who's promotable. I may not be thinking that anyone's going to follow them because they never share their ideas. The company is missing out on the innovation and the creativity that person could offer if they were valued for their different experience and different perspective.
Back to connection, if they were connected enough to allow that person to share whatever it is that they're hiding.
Yes. And oftentimes it takes a leader being willing to create that space for connection, but also willing to share parts of themselves, to say, hey, I have felt challenged at parts of my career. Here's what this looks like. I'm not perfect either. And I think in our imperfection, we actually are perfect. I've had people say, you had a physical disability, you couldn't hide it. And I also share how I hid it because you can hide. And I even talk to people who have physical disabilities, like wheelchair users and other people with physical disabilities that you can see. And they say, well, I can't hide mine. I said, I'm just curious. Do you share the challenges that you go through? Do you share the successes you have? Because that's a piece of hiding too. Many of us, Shanti, and maybe some of your listeners, don't share their dreams or aspirations because they're afraid of an eye roll or a side glance, someone being like, oh, you can't do that. I know I had someone in my life who, when I was talking about creating this movement of unhiding, they rolled their eyes. I said, you just rolled your eyes. And they said, I did? Yeah. And that's not okay with me, because that's why people don't share things, because they're afraid of the judgment and the rejection and the not measuring up.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. Everything that's not getting shared and what's being left off the table because we're somehow not meeting in the middle and having those conversations.
Yeah. Not giving ourselves permission and also not getting permission. The other piece I guess I'll add is unhiding is also a privilege. And I recognize that in being able to have this conversation with you too, is there are certain groups, even at the end of 2024, where it is unsafe to unhide. And that's a reality. And that's an awful reality. And that's why I'm not advocating that you go out and do a podcast with you that you have to, or write a book or do a TEDx. I'm thinking with the 4 steps, find one person to invite in. Find your community of people that you can connect with who have a shared experience. It can be 2 or 3 people. It can be one person. Just find someone to start to talk to about this, because the beauty of that, what happens is just like you and I are sharing our story, we're starting to share so that someone else can start their own journey of unhiding and see themselves in us and find that space that it doesn't have to feel so exhausting or so lonely.
Yeah. Assuming that there are many of us hiding things, the things that we traditionally think about, maybe the things we don't traditionally think about, knowing that can spiral in time. The thing that you did and that you're recommending, or one of the steps, is to reach out and bring someone in. How do you catch yourself before that, though? How do you start to get out of that web enough to be able to acknowledge that it's taken on a life of its own and that there must be a way out of it?
I think it starts today. I think it starts by asking yourself, what am I hiding and how is it holding me back from connecting? How is it holding me back from feeling like I belong? Are there areas in my life where I haven't shared something about myself because I'm afraid of judgment? I'm afraid of rejection. And why? And looking at who can I invite in? For me, Shanti, it was a combination of therapy, like we mentioned. It was journaling and it was meditation. And I read some of those journal entries now, and they're painful to look at, and they were spelled out. I felt really alone. I felt disconnected. How do we create space so that you can acknowledge it? Because again, once you write something down, you can't unsee it. You have a chance and a choice to do something with it, but the choice is yours. And that's where I think a lot of this unhiding, it's about personal choice. It's about saying, I have a choice. Yet you can't get to that choice unless you've acknowledged it. And I imagine anyone who's listening today with us has a chance right now and a choice to ask themselves, what am I hiding and how is it holding me back? Again, most of us, I might even argue all of us, are hiding something about ourselves at some point.
Yeah. Acknowledging it to yourself and then knowing that there's a choice, that there is a way out that you can choose. And perhaps it won't be as difficult as you anticipated.
I really think about the person that you invite in too. It's also allowing for a pause, because sometimes we share something with someone, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, Shanti, but I know it's happened to me, where somebody will tell me something and I wasn't ready for it, right? And maybe I thought I probably should have said the answers, that I should have looked it up, but I didn't know. How did we allow for a pause so that someone can ask questions or someone can sit with something a little bit? It doesn't mean we're rejecting them. It doesn't mean that we're not understanding. It's that sometimes we don't have information we didn't know. I had someone recently share with me that they had Crohn's disease. I don't know enough about Crohn's disease. And so what was beautiful in the interaction is they allowed for the pause and they allowed me to ask questions, to say, when does it affect you? What kind of foods does it affect you with? What should I know? What are the signs? What should I be thinking about? And it was such a beautiful interaction because it allowed for pause. As the person receiving something that someone felt like they needed to hide, it allowed for me to be with them and be present and not think I had to have all the answers on the other side either, or the right reaction. Because sometimes that messes us up too.
Oh, that's a beautiful observation. And I think in the unburdening ourselves of whatever it is, we're very much in our own thing. And to think about the other person and allow for that space for them to just absorb. And
because we've had time with it sometimes, right?
Right.
If we're the blurter, we have time with it. We're like, oh, this is how I've worked through it, or I just need to tell you. And the other person hasn't had all that time to think about it with us. So how do we offer them grace?
Yeah. So I'm going to pivot to a part of the podcast that I call, it's my podcast, so there will be music. And my question is, if there were a song that you could put in a time capsule and preserve for all time at all costs for future generations, what would it be and why?
What comes to mind is Sarah Bareilles' Brave. And I say that because it's a little bit of a pump me up song in terms of Unhiding. First of all, it's a good dance beat. I like it. So that's a piece of it. But I think what it says is just be brave with yourself. Things can get you down. Things can be tough. And yet it's our words and our stories and our strength that actually allows us to connect, that allows us to be beautiful. And there are days I have to play that song just to remind myself. It often shows up in my Instagram posts too, because I'm like, yeah, you wrote a book and not everyone's going to love your book. Not everyone's going to love your TEDx. Not everyone's going to love everything. Just be brave, because the people, and I imagine this in podcasting too, and the work that you're doing, the people who need you will find you, and they're your people. And just be brave, because they need to hear it.
Yeah. And it's amazing how music can bring you back just instantly.
And say what you want to say.
Yes.
I should have said that. How come I didn't say that? Yeah.
I love Sarah. So I am excited to have this added to the Spotify playlist. Thank you for sharing that song. Yeah. As we're winding toward the end here, what would you like to tell people about where they can find you?
I have a website, ruthrathblott.com. I also spend a lot of time talking about career and workplace and leadership. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so under my name, Ruth Rathblott. And then probably to get to know me, like the actual unhidden me and the sides of me that travel and go to a lot of theater and love Central Park in New York City for my mental health, I spend a lot of time on Instagram. So I would say my website, LinkedIn, and Instagram are probably the best places. And then share your story with me. I think that's a piece of it too. I have a place on my website where any of your listeners can offer just to let out their story, and it's anonymous. And they can choose whether I use it in a book or on a podcast or invite them for coaching or consulting, but it's a place to just let it out.
I wasn't aware that you have that. I love that.
I've had many people just be able to share things that they have felt like they had to hide. And then the other side of unhiding, right? Like where people have felt like, I can't tell anyone. Nobody will understand that. Think about it. I unhid a hand. Most people will be like, okay, that's not a big deal. Like, fine. But you know what? To me, unhiding is a big deal. It's a powerful process and it deserves to be celebrated.
Thank you so much for being here, for everything that you shared, for making me be a bobblehead again. All of the links to you will be in the show notes. I look forward to people finding you. I'm sure they will be doing that. And I look forward to finding ways to continue this conversation. So thank you.
Same. Thank you.
So that brings this episode of Stories We Haven't Shared to a close. I believe stories are our humanity waiting to be shared, and listening makes it possible. Thanks so much for being here today by our virtual campfire. Until next time, and thanks again to Ruth.